Thank you so much, Shannon. Appreciate it. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our continuing NOAA Fisheries EBM, EBFM seminar series for 2023. We're continuing the series, which began back in 2017, and our main objective has been to increase awareness about ecosystem-based management and highlight the progress that NOAA and our partners are making here in the States. But today we are taking a slight change, and we're going to have our speaker focus in on the efforts that are underway in Europe and sort of the challenges and struggles that they have there with respect to this very complex approach to managing our ocean's resources. NOAA Library, as you can see, continues to be our valuable co-host for this series. The series is often offered every month from 3 to 4, the second Wednesday of each month. And as Shannon pointed out, it's publicly accessible and recorded and archived. So please share this with your colleagues for those who couldn't join us today. I just want to mention that we will have another presentation seminar scheduled on October 11th. And it's going to be a slightly different one. We have the fellows from the Cooperative Institute for the Atlantic region. So we'll have a number of fellows that are focusing in on the research. The fellows are largely early professional environmental scientists in their careers. So it should be a very intriguing presentation from all the fellows from the Institute, the Cooperative Institute. So please join us on the 11th of October at 3 again in the afternoon at Eastern Time. And I would like to take this opportunity to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Anna Rindorf from the Danish Technical University, has been leading an EBFM effort with many of her colleagues across Europe. And so we're going to get a bird's eye view of what's underway within Europe. And we look forward to Anna's presentation. So thanks, Anna. As you can well see, it's late in the evening for Anna in Denmark. And so we appreciate all her efforts to help us and present today. So thank you, Anna. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, and thank you for inviting me to speak. It's always interesting because you get a chance to sit back and think about what you've done, so that's always nice. And I've titled the presentation Ecosystem-Based Management in Theory and Practice, because theory was kind of what we tried to do, and practice is what seems to be happening around us when we try to do things. So just to start, so you know what to expect. So there'll be a little bit of history on what was the sort of aim to protect in Europe and how well we're doing actually reaching that goal. Then there's some talk about taking legislation and advice into real world. So I'll look at some cases, and they're supposed to be simple, and now we're trying to be more complex for the future. When we go more complex, we're trying to sort of not be too confusing and focus on some key issues. So how are we going to try to find out what those are? And then some thoughts on whether this will actually produce the results in management that we really want to change, the stuff that we actually want to achieve with it. So let's go ahead. So basically, advising management came from simple single species fisheries. So you all know this. We had in Europe, these are all the ISIS stocks, the fishing mortality and the anomaly that showed here. So we had severely overfished stocks from the 70s to 2000. Everything was just fished like crazy. So these are the North Sea ones, just for to see a single area, and you can see that you can't really see they were overfished, but they were actually severely overfished from the 1970s to 2000. And since then, we actually have had a decline in fishing mortality. So there was this aim to reduce fishing to FMSY, so that was incorporated after following all the World Summit and all that stuff. So we have had a big decline in fishing mortality. And it comes from this FMSY implementation. So it's not just Europe doing this. We also have Norway that has implementation of something about that's more similar to MEY. So in general, we have this large improvement. We still have some stocks that are struggling. So all the cod stocks remain a big concern. So they are not doing too well south of Norway and Iceland. So there are still stocks not doing well, but in general, single species fisheries hasn't been that, it's not like it's unsuccessful. It did more or less what it was supposed to do. But what about all the ecosystem stuff? So that the fisheries are well, they're not the simple part, but at least we have more or less control over that. The ecosystem part in the EU legislation, so this is a little different from yours, but I think it's interesting to see how they how it sort of came by in the historical sense, because it tells you something about what people are really concerned about. So the first one was actually in 1979 with the Birds Directive, and it's basically aiming to protect birds. It's been updated since. It protects their living areas. So that was the first of all the directives. The second one was about water quality. It's called the Water Framework Directive. It came in '87, so we had almost 10 years between the two. Then in '92, there was a Habitat Directive, which protects mammals, reptiles, and habitats. There are a little bit of fish in there, but they are mostly diaderma species. So in general, for the marine, it's just the mammals, reptiles, and the habitats. So we have birds, water quality, mammals, reptiles, and habitats. And then more recently, in 2008, we have this big thing, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, that is sort of getting everything together. So it's adding other things like invasive species and litter and noise and contaminants. Those are added into the directives, or on top of the other directives. And lastly, now we also have, from 2014, we have the Marine Spatial Planning Directive, which says it should all happen in the same space. So I'm not going to talk so much about the happening in the same space, because there aren't a lot of worked examples on that yet. So I'll just keep to the first four. But just to remind you, so it's the birds, the water quality, the mammals, and everything together. Oh yeah, and one thing is that there's not much actually in the way of clear social and economic targeted directives. So we talk a lot about how we put in the social component in the social ecological systems in science, but there's not a lot in the directives about that. So there is something in the fisheries policy that's about this, but otherwise it's pretty vague in the other ones. So let's have a look at how good they did. So how was the success rate of the different directives? So if you look at seabirds, the columns here say from 94 up to 2023. The different, they're almost a decade apart. The blue ones is the specially protected species. How many of those are still of concern? So you can see the blue columns are declining. So less and less species are of concern, which is a good thing. They're not disappearing. They're just not of concern anymore. The other one, the orange ones, those are the species that are not protected. So those are basically huntable species. And there you can see there's been an increase in the number of species that have conservation concerns. So the directives have done, at least we have succeeded in actually decreasing the number of stocks that are of conservation concern for the protected ones, but the other ones are actually increasing. So this is the ones about the water quality, and it's just an example. One of the things that are measured, there's lots of stuff that's measured in the water quality, but one of them is chlorophyll A. So this is chlorophyll A off the Dutch coast. So you can see it's declining around the same time actually as fisheries are declining. So it had a stable high level from 1990 to 2000, and then it's declining. So something is happening there too. It's the Dutch coast is in the North Sea, so that looks like we're actually achieving something. If you look at all the different regions, it looks a little more colorful or maybe a little more depressing. So the classification status of the area that's found to be a problem area, so you want this percentage that's in the table there to be low, because then there's a lot of big problematic area, and the North Sea is part of the Northeast Atlantic Ocean, where we actually don't have so big eutrophication problems, but you can see the other seas have bigger areas. In some cases, they have positive trends. So the Baltic Sea and the Northeast Atlantic Ocean have positive trends in eutrophication, but in other cases, it's not actually looking so good. So not a full success for that one. So that one's still an issue. If we go for the mammals, well, basically the seal populations of some of the species have increased a lot in many areas, and it means that there is a perceived competition with fishes that's going up. I know this happens all over. So seals going up. But small whales are actually a little more difficult to monitor. So this is an example of harbor porpoise development in different areas, and white-beaked dolphins and minke whales. And you can see they don't count them very often. It's very expensive to go out and count from the scans. They do these surveys at sea. So they're not doing that very often. And when you do it, there's quite a lot of uncertainty around. So it's quite difficult to say if there's any development in these populations, or they're just basically at the same level. So difficult to monitor. not much evidence of a positive development, but on the other hand, not much evidence of decline as well. So also the Habitat Directive is talking about habitats. So habitats are generally protected if they're perceived to be sensitive, and there are areas laid out to protect the habitats. They're not necessarily closed for fishing, though. Depends on what they are closed for. And then impacts in non-sensitive areas tends to follow fishing pressure. But we'll get back to that with an example a little bit later. So not some success for birds, some success for water. We don't really know about the mammals. I put in these the success rates of the directives for sensitive fish. It's kind of cheating because there was actually no dedicated management for any of the sensitive fish species. So they were just in luck because probably because of this, or it may be because of this decrease in fishing effort and fishing pressure. There's been a rebuilding of a lot of the species. So about 3/4 of the species are increasing. And then there are some exceptions to that. The species that are on the southern border, so the wolffish on the right there, seems to not be increasing. There's also on the left, there's the common skate complex. There was a paper a couple of years ago showing that they had disappeared in European waters. That's not actually the case. What happens is they have changed their Latin name to 2 other species. So they are actually still increasing in our waters, or in European waters. So this was kind of they were lucky to be rebuilding because of the decrease in fishing management or in fishing pressure, but it's not actually any dedicated measures to protect them. Okay, so altogether, we managed some specific pressures, which has close links to some impacts, and it seems to be working for the targeted fish stocks, also for the fish bycatch stocks, and also for nutrient load. There's still a lot of focus on seabirds and not really big success out of the Seabird Directive, if you consider that it was started 50 years ago, almost. Marine mammals, difficult to monitor except for the seals that you can see hauling out on the beach. The impacts of trawling on the bottom are increasingly in focus now, so I'll have an example on that later. It's become a specific topic under the Marine Strategic Framework Directive, so it's come up, but there is no agreed targets on it yet. Okay, so actually, what I think is interesting about this is that none of these areas are really ecosystem-based management. They are rather a single issue management. So you have one thing that you're concerned about and you're trying to fix that, but you're not trying to fix more than one thing at a time, which is nice and simple, but it's not really ecosystem-based management. You kind of have to think about all of the things together to get there. So let's have some examples. So this is a real-life example where we're trying to manage 2 species instead of 1. So this is about sand eels and seabirds in Firth of Forth. So Firth of Forth is off Scotland. It's a bay there, and it has an island with many seabirds that are observed every year. So there's really good data on them. And one of them is this one, the kittiwake, and they're feeding off sand eel. Sand eel are caught by a fishery in the area as well. And in the end of the 1990s, there was a big effort to try to find out if the sand eel fishery that was going on was competing with the seabirds for food and had a negative impact on the seabirds. There was discussion about that all along the UK coast, but it was only this area of Scotland that had data that seemed to show something. So basically what we found at that time was that the catch per day in the fishery and the breeding success was linked. And it wasn't because the fishery was taking a lot, but probably they were both responding to the biomass of sand eels. So both responding to the same thing. But even though there wasn't really any, it was very difficult to show that there was an impact of the fishing on the breeding success. With this link, it was clearly likely that there could be an impact. So the area around this breeding colony was closed in 2000 to fishing. So there's now this big closed area or box there, where there's only a couple of samples taken every year so the fishery goes in, takes some samples, goes back out again. So the good thing about this area is that they actually kept up the data collection. So they have really been collecting data for a long time on seabirds. And they just, or Kate Searle and a lot of other people just did an example of how it actually, whether it actually worked. So try to look at the data for these 4 different species. So these graphs show the first blot of dots there is before the fishery started. then it's during the high fishery, and then it's after the closure and the regulation of the fishery was more, it's sort of more closely regulated now. So there's been a much lower fishery in the third of those 3 periods. So basically you can see that guillemots, puffins, and razorbill have been declining throughout the time series, regardless of basically of managing the fishery or not. Whereas for kittiwakes, there's been a little bit of an increase after the fishery was regulated. For kittiwakes, it's really lucky because there's also data within the closure zone and outside the closure zone. So there's a control area where we can, there's not a fishery and no closure. And you can see that we still see this decline, which is kind of similar to the other seabirds, but it was much worse in the period where the fishery was going on in the closed area, whereas now it's kind of the difference between the control area and the closure area, it's much smaller now. So there has been an effect of closing that box there and managing the fishery next to the colony on kittiwakes. So, and just who did all this work? Well, there was quite a lot of involving fishers in collecting data, involving seabird experts, having lots of meetings, going out to tell the fishermen that this was actually probably an issue they needed to do something about. So there was a lot of involvement of the fishers and the seabird experts along the way. Now we enter the political scene. So this was in 2000, the area was closed. We've been collecting data and then showing the results of that. Basically, what happens now is that the seabird colonies in the UK and elsewhere are not recovering at the rate that, you know, you could see they're still declining in further forth, and other places are not recovering very fast. There's actually not been any sampling, so it's not like that we had this major concern, so we started to collect some data. It was more like we still collect the same data. So we still have the data from the Scottish area, but not outside of that area. Well, but generally they're not rebuilding, so something has to be done. There's been a report for asking for specific recommendations and for recovering the seabirds, and there's a lot of issues for the different stocks or the different populations of seabirds, so it kind of depends on the species what the major issues are. And there's a whole list of predators and other issues. And for kittiwakes, it's also clear that there is an effect of fishing forage fish next to the colonies. So we have this closed area to try to take care of that. The next thing that happened was that the UK has suggested a closure of all of the UK zone for fishing sand eel. So that's about 300 kilometers off the coast, so much bigger than the current area. And there's not really a regulation of other important prey suggested. So what I think is interesting about this is we actually have evidence about where this is a problem and what we can do. And we're kind of running into a policy process where something else is, it's kind of seen as insufficient. So whatever we have recommended, it's insufficient to achieve what we want. So something else has to be done, and then a decision is made from a sort of policy standpoint rather than any sort of supporting evidence. And now you could get the idea that I'm only bringing this up because it's the UK and Denmark and I'm Danish, and that's why we're trying to bring this case up. But actually, it's more because I was actually involved in it, so I know something about it. But let's have a look at some other examples instead. So basically, first, it was 2 species. It was difficult to do, and it's not really clear who are the stakeholders because the people involved were not necessarily unhappy with the process there. So, okay, but let's go on to some other things. So this study here is about documented bycatch of small cetaceans and seabirds in gill nets. So this shows a CCTV camera over the side of a vessel. It's a little blurry, so it's a little difficult to see. So he's basically hauling it in his gill net over the side of the vessel, and the camera here captures whatever falls out of the net or is stuck in the net as he hauls in. So there's a seabird there and a porpoise as well, both of them. So all these data are collected by voluntary CCTV. So where we have there's a scientist that goes out and convinces all the small gillnet fishing vessels that they really need to work to prevent bycatch of seabirds and mammals, and they also need to help us document it so we can see how big an issue it is. So it's all voluntary. There's no requirement for anyone to carry cameras or document things. Basically, all the stuff they got out of this camera information, all the time series they have there, they've combined with fine-scale fishing effort. So they have the fishing effort of the vessels with the cameras, and assuming that the other vessels do the same thing, you can document bycatch or the likely bycatch in space and time. So you can then actually, so once you have the bycatch, so and so many animals are caught, you can compare that to any agreed limits, but there aren't actually any limits for seabirds. The regulation is that you shouldn't actually catch protected seabirds, and there should be no excessive mortality of them. Some of them are still hunted, so it's a little unclear, but if there is a limit, it's probably low for seabirds. For porpoise, there is a limit agreed, and all the studies that have been done show that we're quite close to the limit for the porpoise bycatch, which for the part that's actually sustainable for the population. And whether we're on one side or the other, it depends a little bit on the calculation method and the study, but we are definitely around the limit. So we're not in a place where we want to increase this, we rather want to decrease it probably. So following all this, there's been mandatory use of pingers in some areas. So if there are areas that are defined to be protected for porpoises, you need to carry pingers in these areas. The pinger is a little acoustic device that scares off the porpoises of the gillnet, so it really reduces the bycatch in those areas. There's no similar device for seabirds. So there's no, not that, it's not just that it's not mandatory, but there is no really well-functioning gadget you can put on your nets. So we had a documentation of how much it was caught and the mandatory use of the pingers in the selected area as a management result. But let's get back to the policy themes. So these are examples of how many animals you're going to catch if you implement the pingers that are mandatory, and if you do not implement the pingers. And the amount of red tells you whether you have like a large bycatch or a smaller bycatch. One of the things you can see is that the CCTV and the pinger use is not actually mandatory in all areas and also not for all vessels. So CCTV is still voluntary. Pinger use is mandatory in some areas. So off the coast there and sort of towards the top and west, that is an area where it's mandatory to use the pingers. But in some of the other areas, there's actually quite a lot of promoting of small-scale gillnet fishing to be really environmentally friendly and better than trawling. So it's the CO2 economic version of catching fish, and it takes place from small boats, so it's much more socially friendly maybe as well. So it's kind of being promoted a lot. But you can see one of the areas here. I'll see if there's an error coming. This one, there's been a suggestion to completely go to only having gillnet fishery or other environmentally friendly fishery, so no trawling in that area. And one of the things that you can see in the two maps is that they're actually identical for this area, so there's no change because this area doesn't have a mandatory pinger use. It has a lot of bycatch problems, so we know that it's a big bycatch area, but it doesn't actually have any rules on pinger implementation. So let's look a little bit more on that area, but we'll look first about what it actually is that we're worried about with the benthic impacts of trawling. So this just goes through what is done in the North Sea. So basically the way that it's done throughout most of Europe is that we have this benthic impact mapping. It is based on the sensitivity of the benthic communities. The sensitivity is derived from the median longevity of the individuals in that habitat. So if they are long-lived, they're more sensitive. If they're short-lived, they're less sensitive. So you have this, or we have this map of sensitivity of all the waters. We also have a map of all the impact of all the fishing gears that are fishing in each area. So this is a combination of information on exactly where fishing is taking place and the gear they're using. So together that, if you use a very hard gear, you get more abrasion, and if you use a very sort of a less heavy gear, you get less abrasion. But all of it summed together provides you with this map of abrasion. So we have the sensitivity of the layers and the abrasion. There's then an impact model, which is basically a kind of a surplus production model, so which tells you how impacted is this area from the abrasion that when you combine that with the sensitivity. And you can see there are some dark areas. So the dark green is where it's a lot impacted. The yellow, pale yellow, is where you actually have very low impact. But you can see there are some definite areas where there's a lot of fishing going on and there's a lot of impact as well. So the map is quite nice to look at, but it's actually not really telling you much about what is what is allowed impact. So we don't have like we had a number for the porpoises, this many porpoises can be caught. We don't actually have that for habitat impact. So the suggested threshold now is that the area that is impacted by fishing is suggested to be less than 20%. So that's basically the most recent guidance from the Commission. And then there hasn't really been an agreement on when is an area impacted, but probably if the impact is greater than 0.2, something like that is what's been sort of mentioned in the documents, but it hasn't been agreed. So if you compare this to the idea that we should have protected areas in 30% of our marine habitats, you're actually not, 20% is less than 30, right? So you're not necessarily very high up. But those are the two numbers that are in play right now. So let's have a look at how they actually, how much is it? So these are all the habitat types. They are ranked. So the top ones are the ones which cover the greatest area. And then there's the mean impact in that area and the fraction of that habitat that is untrawled. So if you look at the ones where you have untrawled habitat is less than the 20%, so that's kind of the guidance that is there now. We have quite a bit of, so 4 different habitats that have less than 20% untrawled. So if you look at the offshore mud there, it actually has only 5% of that habitat is untrawled. So it's really, there's a lot of impact on that one, or a big area is impacted for that one. We also have the ones that that we sort of have aimed to protect with the Habitat Directive is also the rocks and the biogenic reefs. So those are actually not very much impacted. And the habitat called unknown here is also not very impacted. But there are quite a lot of them that actually have more than half of their area is not impacted by trawling. So they're not necessarily very impacted. They're already living up to the 20% and more. So different habitats are impacted in different ways. But how much is going on? If we go back to policy and the area I was talking about, where we were worried about the porpoises being bycaught, well, there's been some suggestions for closing areas, and so the closures of the areas is to protect the rock and biogenic reefs. So there's been a little more of that. You can see it was already well protected, but there will be some more of that. So that's nice. There's also this widespread public demand for reducing trawling, and it's all over Europe. So it's not a specific Danish example here. It goes on everywhere. There's also, at the same time, that's not all over Europe, but in Danish waters, there are increased areas with oxygen deficiency. So basically, this map here shows in 2010 the oxygen deficient areas, and the red one is the oxygen deficiency. They changed a little bit the coloring of the maps. So the next one here, which is 2021, basically the red area is now the oxygen deficient area. So you can see it's gotten a lot bigger, and it's not because they didn't sample in 2010, it's because it got so much warmer at the same time that even with the same nutrient load, you get greater areas of oxygen deficiency. So you have quite a lot of areas here where stuff on the bottom dies during the summertime when we have these oxygen deficiencies. So this was the area we were talking about. We want to or there was a suggestion to close all trawling in that area to protect the benthic habitats there. Let's have a look. So what are the current fishing impacts if we're taking them all together in that area? We have the trawl impact. So we can do an impact map similar to what I showed before. This one is one of the impact maps that's been done. So everything that's yellow is very impacted, or the palest green. So those are the ones we're trying to limit, but you can see the amount of dots here. The limit for being impacted was we could impact up to 80% and still be within the guidance. So it's, and there, even if you don't have the table, it's not actually impacting 80%. So there is some impact in some areas. It's unclear what is happening relative to the guidelines for the limits there. We can also look at the porpoises. That's what I showed before. So we have an area where we're worried that the bycatch of porpoises is too big. It's the same area here. Also, another thing we could have a look at is how is it actually developing over time. So this is the trawl fishery. It so happens that the trawl stocks there are not doing very well. So we actually have, these are the trends of the catches there, and the effort, I should say. So the value and effort landed there from these areas, and the red and orange colors is where it's decreasing. So there's less trawling going on. The blue and green ones are where there's more trawling going on. So you can see most of this area, it's kind of declining already. If you look at gill nets, you can see kind of the opposite trend, so a bit more blue and green, and in particular, you see more blue and green more coastal, so it goes closer to the shore, and these are the areas where there's actually also a lot of seabirds in the area. So we have the porpoises and the seabirds and the gill nets there. So trawl is impacting the bottom. We're probably within what is the guidance now. The trawl is also decreasing. Porpoise, we're probably above what we should be in terms of how many we're catching, and it seems to be increasing with the gears that are catching the porpoises. So, and this is all coming at a time where there is broad agreement in the public that trawl fishing is bad and gill nets are environmentally friendly alternative gears. And you can't help but wonder whether we actually included the right stakeholders in all the talks we had. So we had a lot of people involved in these different processes. So fishers and NGOs on the trawl impact, and the porpoise bycatch has been done also with fishers and NGOs and environmental ministry. But we kind of must be a little bit off the point if what comes out of it is we're trying to protect more of the stuff that maybe does not need so much protecting, and at the expense of the stuff that actually needs our protection. So you can't help but wonder whether we actually talk to the right people along the way. Okay, so before going more complex, I'll just sum up. So a lot of what has been going on in policy doesn't necessarily have a lot to do with the facts, and it seems to have a lot to do with what everybody knows already. So if you know something is true, you don't actually need to see any facts to support your knowledge. And if you see some facts, there are more exceptions to the rule than actually something you need to do something with. And the people that are making these decisions on what everybody knows aren't the people that we have included in the process. And so we need to think about how to get those involved. And while that has been going on, I've also been leading a project that is continuing to include the usual people. So as a first step, but let's have a look at how we did that, and just put aside for a while that we probably need to talk to some other people as well. Okay, so that was actually a lot of, well, complex situations, but at least we have a limited number of things that we looked at, and the stuff I showed you had no social indicators or other things we needed to trade off. So just the bycatch, the benthic impact, and the fishery there. But we now have to try to find out what do we do when we have even more complexity. And one of the ways you can do that is by trying to focus on a few things, so make complexity less again, that you think are really important to you. But who's going to decide on that? So we asked in the SEAwise project here, we asked that stakeholders throughout Europe whether they thought, what are important parts of EBFM advice that they would like to see some advice on. We were trying to use different methods. So I've previously done the same thing, but in workshops where you have a facilitator that's a scientist, but you kind of get concerned that the scientist might be biasing the process. So we tried to make both individual exercises and consultations where people just sat on their own and found out what was important. And we also had group consultations, and then we had a separate sort of track which did the same thing for scientists to try to find out whether the scientists actually had the same opinions of what was important as the stakeholders, and also whether there was a difference between the methodologies. So the individual ones were basically asking people, they got a map and then a list or a sort of a slide with pictures to give them suggestions of what they might put in their map. They could do them on PowerPoint like these ones, or they could write them in their hand. So people did different things. They could also have so the group exercises, we had word clouds and talked about what was important. People typed in words on their own, and then these word clouds summarize which words are mentioned by more than one person. So we have a lot of people there, and they're not identified by their names in the process. So some of them are not unique. That means if you did an individual slide, you could also have done, participated in the word cloud. So it's 270 participants, but they might be the same, some of them. And then we got lots and lots of words. And then we kind of got, we had all these words and weren't really sure what to do with them, because many of them are different words for kind of the same topic. So we ended up classifying the words. So we had more than more than 2,700 words, and we ended up classifying them into these topics that are in the FAO manual for ecosystem based management. And so they're basically about the ability to achieve the ecological well-being and the human well-being. And then there are different words that sort of fit into these categories. And then these different columns are all different regions in around Europe. So it's basically the first one's the Baltics. So there are different regions around. The all acts is all the stakeholders together, and the all scientists is what came out of the scientists consultation. And the different colors, the green colors there are the social impacts that we're looking at, so the social system impacts, and the bluish colors are the ecological system. And there tends to be quite a lot of variability between the different groups, you can see, but in general, the scientists tended to have more ecological stuff, so more blue stuff in their column and less green stuff, and yeah, maybe a little bit less purple stuff as well. So the green stuff is about governance, human well-being, and livelihood, and the blue stuff is about the fish species, the ecosystem, and the external ecological drivers. So you can see there's a little bit of bias in what they were actually interested in. There's also within the columns, so within the general ecosystem, for example, it was not the same things that they mentioned, so there was a little bit of a difference in that as well. But the next thing we did was to try to find out whether we actually have knowledge for the things that we want knowledge for. So try to match the papers that we find in a systematic review with the topics that were mentioned as important. So both the papers and the scoping had climate, fish stocks, and MPAs as the top stuff. So really important things. Bycatch was mentioned quite a lot in the scoping, but wasn't mentioned a lot in the papers. It probably had a little bit to do with wording as well. It's when you do a systematic review, you have to pick the words very, you have to think a lot about the words you pick. So there might be something there, but it wasn't as frequently studied as the other ones. We had economic aspects where there was paper support, and it was also seen as key. So those were landing value, profit, fuel cost, revenue, economically viable fishing. So lots of things that you can easily measure. Whereas quite a lot of other things weren't actually in the papers, though they were quite frequent in the scoping. So these are like things like impacts of wind farms, non-fishing impacts, food supply and food security, and pollution. There was a lot of people talking about that in the scoping, but it wasn't really frequent in the papers. So the next thing we did was to try to find out what are we managing then? So what are the indicators that we're using in management? So this figure, and I'm sorry, it has a slightly different color code than the other one. It shows on the first column, it's what were the topics identified by the stakeholders in the scoping. The second one shows where was the knowledge available in the systematic review. And the last one is which indicators are actually used for management. So you can see the colors are not the same in the three columns there. So basically, if we look at things like human well-being and governance, it's not really well presented in our management system. So we think it's important, but we're not actually monitoring it. So it's kind of difficult to know whether it's working out the way that we want it to. We also have things like ecological and human drivers, which are mentioned. So ecological drivers could be climate change, human drivers could be wind farms, for example. And they were mentioned quite a lot in the scoping. They also appear in the systematic review, but they don't actually appear in any clear wording in the management system. So it's unclear how the management indicators would change if you do something to these ecological and human drivers. And in general, the management system is very biased towards retained species and the general ecosystem. So this is basically, they have much more indicators on ecology than they have on social and economy. So the kind of one of the conclusions was that we need some more work on the social aspects and the effects of non-fishing drivers. So stuff that isn't fishing, but climate change and other human actors. How does that actually impact our stocks? And how do we actually put that into our system? And it's not actually in the management system now, so we need to find a way to do that too. So probably we need to adapt our advice as well to get more of the social stuff in there, and maybe some of the drivers and what their impact actually is. Okay, so in total, we have an idea about the things we want, the things we know about, and the things that are actually in the governance system right now. So basically, because we're all modelers, we thought, let's go model something. And this is just one of the examples. There's a lot of modeling going on. But this one is using a fleet-based model, FLBIA, to predict impacts. And the first plot over here with the has the number of stocks with a risk to their biomass reference point, the number of stocks that are fished below FMSY, or the proportion of stocks fished below FMSY. It has things like catch, gross profit, wages for different scenarios. And the other one, the purple scenario, I should say, is the current one. So you can see basically quite a lot of purple stocks here. There's quite a lot of risk for being below the biomass reference points. The right-hand side of the figure shows the stuff that we're trying to add. So basically the porpoise bycatch, for example, seal bycatch as well. It has, in the bottom, it has the benthic impact, so effort of different trawls that impact the bottom a lot. At the time of when we did the fleet-based model runs, we didn't actually have the limits from the commission yet on what would be an acceptable impact. So we couldn't actually do that at that time, but we're going to update that as well. So you can see again that the purple there is the current effort with the current fishing effort. So we have quite a lot of stocks still below the biomass reference point and quite a high impact on basically all of the ecological system issues that we're worried about. We do have lower wages as well. So it's not like right now we're not in the case of let's choose between having high profit and high wages and having biodiversity. We're more thinking probably it would be good to decrease fishing a bit, and then you could have more of all of it. So it's kind of an easy situation, except that in the first year you usually will have some negative impacts, but on the longer term, there's at least not a conflict between the different goals here. So basically, the next thing we want to do is we'll try to make a toolbox because we're scientists and we think it's a good way to tell people about the stuff we do. So lots of shinies to try to see if we can make the results visible and try to make them visible in a way that has the complexity if you want it, but it's not overwhelming you with complexity when you open it. So you're trying to sort of start out simple and go more complex. And you can see these are already pretty complex. We're doing it with ISIS, so we're hoping that it will get a longer life than just our project to try to move on. So one of the things I've thought about after the other two examples that I showed, which basically haven't happened within the last year, both of them, is what will actually happen when our tool meets the people outside of our project and they have to use it for ecosystem-based fisheries management. Well, I actually tried, or we tried in the project to follow the steps that, so you have these, there's a paper on with these 10 revolutions by Cook on how to go about getting your work used in management. And it doesn't seem to guarantee that they're actually using the knowledge. So we basically had to realize that the facts that we're pulling together are not actually enough to change the mind of people. You have to do something else. And also probably integrating the end users is a good thing, but we need to think about who is it we're integrating. Is it the people that are actually making the policy or someone else? And I think actually the conclusion is we need to find some ways to engage the wider public to use the knowledge that we have instead of the knowledge that they think they have. And it's not that I'm not in favor of all the lobbying organizations. I think they can be good at spreading news, but I think in many times, a lot of times they're actually spreading what they think are the correct news, but maybe not the actual news. So we need to find out how we're actually getting through to the people that make the policy rather than just the stakeholders we're usually including. Okay, so with that, I hope you have maybe some questions or comments. And if you have any good advice for how to make it work in the public, I'm all ears. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was wonderful. I really appreciate that. Shannon, do we have any questions coming in? I might want to give folks a few moments to get the questions posted there.
I do see one question that just came in, and that is, how did you find and select the participants for the word cloud and discussion groups?
Yeah, so we use there are fishermen's NGOs, joint organizations that are advising the commission. So basically they meet together in groups regionally, and we ask those groups and then snowball out of those groups if they could point to other people. The thing is that it's very difficult to get to the sort of wider public to get them engaged in the same way when they have to actually go to a workshop. And we've used these groups before as they have a pretty broad national coverage, so it's providing a good broad coverage. For the Mediterranean, it's a little different because they're area, it works a little different with the advisory council there. So we have had local consultations with nationally instead. So we had to round up people nationally and talk to them as well. We tried to get tried to get enough NGO representation that we could separate them from the others. And we can do that, but we don't have enough NGOs in every area to do that in every area to see if they had different viewpoints. So we could maybe have that as different angles.
Awesome, thank you so much. And related to the stakeholders, you mentioned that you would like to bring in some additional stakeholders or additional people to contribute. Could you talk a little bit more about who you think would be really good additions to your research into the project?
Yeah, I've tried previously. Often it's difficult to get the NGOs and the fishers in the same room to talk, to agree on stuff when they're all together. So I tried previously to have workshops together with just NGO people and have a discussion with them, and that worked quite well. But I'm also not sure whether they are actually representing the public. So the general public, it seems to be more difficult to get hold of them in a situation like this, and a lot of the public opinion seems to be going on like social media or other places where it's a bit difficult to find out whether they are reflecting, their opinion or a sort of a more general opinion. I think that kind of caught a lot of people by surprise. There's been a couple of examples in Europe where there's been like we had the electric beam trawls, where we had the studies on the beam trawls done at the same time as a French NGO had a campaign saying that electric beam trawl was not very nice to the fish that it was catching. So it got banned in spite of the studies actually showing it had less impact on the bottom than alternative gear types. So it's been quite difficult to control but to make sure you're reflecting the right stakeholders to keep up with this stuff going on outside of our usual arena.
Thanks so much. I just saw another question come in. This next question says, how do you get this information to the fishers and to the communities?
Yeah, so we have a really good collaboration with the groups of fishers in the different countries. All the countries in Europe are not part of the project, so in that way there are some gaps in it, but the major fishing organizations are there, or the major fishing countries are there. So, and we basically have national meetings as well. So we go out and tell the fishers about it, and their representatives go to our meetings and go back and talk about it as well. I don't think they don't really care about the project. They care about the effort and asking them what they think is important. So that part is important to them. So we do a lot of going to meetings to discuss things that are relevant to them right now, rather than maybe the full project, but it's a part of the project and then it's also relevant to them. So we kind of combine the two things.
Awesome, thank you. I am not seeing any more questions come in. So if you do have any questions after today, as I said, you can email Anna directly. And other than that, I will hand this over to Peg to close us out today.
Yes, I just really want to thank Anna for her time and effort and presenting so late in the evening over there. We really learned quite a bit. So thank you so much, Anna, for all the time and effort you put into this. And we hope you can join us, everyone, on October 11th for our next seminar series, next in the series. And that's about it. If you have any other questions, please follow the directions that Shannon just gave. And obviously, if you have colleagues that were unable to join us today, the link to the YouTube video will be available shortly at the NOAA library site. So thank you so much. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks.